Today, the Living Legend Library of Oklahoma is interviewing one of the most interesting pioneer families in the state of Oklahoma, and certainly pioneers of no man's land in Oklahoma, the family of H C Hitch Sr. Hereinafter, we will address him as Henry, and with us is Mrs. Hitch and the son-in-law of the family, Mr. John Gray. H C Hitch Jr. will later be interviewed, and the interview will be attached to this we are taping today. It's with pleasure that I introduce to you Mr. John Gray, son-in-law of Mr. and Mrs. Henry C. Hitch Sr., who is the owner and operator of radio station KLIB at Liberal. John, I may interpolate once in a while, but will you please take over the subject matter of the interview?
Fine, thank you. Raymond Fields, and as Raymond told me just a little bit ago, he is doing this as a labor of love, and we appreciate your efforts in the history of Oklahoma. Mr. Henry Hitch, who I shall, as you say, refer to as Henry, his father, James K. Hitch, originated, Henry, from Tennessee. Under what conditions did your father leave Tennessee and come to the Oklahoma Panhandle?
Well, he left there in 1875 when he was 19 years old. And he couldn't tell the folks goodbye, so he wrote on a big slate where he was going, and he borrowed $10 from the family's saving. He had an aunt with whom she largely brought him up, and she had a friend in Springfield, Missouri, and she told him to go there, and he worked his way west, and when he'd run out of money, he'd work a little while until he could get more, and he finally wound up at Springfield, Missouri. And he went to this man who had a wagon factory there, and he commenced, he was roustabout in a wagon factory, is the way he put it.
Uh-huh.
And Henry Westmoreland, a very substantial farmer in that community, came to town one time, and this man asked him if he couldn't use a bright young man on his farm. He said he could, and my father went out there and commenced working. And Henry Westmoreland had quite a large family, and in that family was a daughter named Mary. Well, they fell in love, and in a short time they were married. And in the latter 70s, my father and grandfather and his brother-in-law, they started west.
What was your brother-in-law's name?
Westmoreland. Ben Westmoreland.
Ben Westmoreland,
And
okay.
Charlie Westmoreland,
Mm-hmm.
with about 1,000 cattle. And they drove them west. There were no cattle in that country. They didn't have to stand guard. They brought cows, and they naturally are not as hard to hold as steer cattle. But I remember my father is very amusing. He said they had a man with him helping the name of Scott, John Scott. He would get up of a morning and looked out over 1,000 head of cattle and said, "Well, boys, I believe there's one gone."
Now, where was J.K. Hitch and his family? Where were they heading for when they left Missouri? Any special place? Did they have a special aim, location?
I don't know. They came to southwest Kansas and settled on the Medicine River near Medicine Lodge.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't stay there long. I do not know for what reason. Then they moved on to Meade County, close on Crooked Creek, and they didn't stay there long. But right in the latter 70s or early 80s, they came on to farther southwest in Kansas and settled on the dry Cimarron River, about 20 miles northwest of Liberal,
This is what is now Seward County?
in what is now Seward County.
Right.
Well, that country commenced settling up. And my father said they got herd low in there, and so he, in the early 80s, he came on down into what is now Texas County, Oklahoma. At that time, it was no man's land. And there was no law here, but he located on the Coldwater Creek down here, 12 miles southeast of the present town of Guyman. He said he was the only person on that creek at the time. There was, however, a ranch who had the headquarters on the Beaver River, the old OX Ranch. It's the old house is still standing over here, about 4 or 5 miles or 6 northeast of Guyman. It's in a tumble-down condition. Well, they had a camp over here on Frisco, and they didn't continue in business but a short time.
This is the OX people?
The OX people. And they gave that camp to their foreman, John Hooker, whose name was really Thrailkill. And he in turn gave it to his father-in-law, and he established his own ranch right up Frisco, about 2 or 3 miles. And that ranch house also is still standing.
And the Frisco empties into the Coldwater Creek.
Yes.
Okay.
But
They're right there
Right.
at the headquarters.
But my father settled there and built it on the Coldwater. Built a 2-room sod house.
Was this house all above ground?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the first house, or did they live in a cave to start with?
No, he first built a little smaller one, little old 1-room. And Uncle Charlie, his younger brother, lived in it one summer, I think. But this is while this was being built, the 2-room. And also then he built a cellar, what we called a cellar in those days, right out in front of it, to store things in and the groceries and things. But we lived in that sod house. Well, also he built what we called a sort of a parlor. It was the best room of rock, right on the north side of that.
About what year was this when
Well,
this
it was
parlor?
probably about 85 or 6, I imagine. I don't remember the years. But anyway, we lived in that until my mother passed away in 91. And I believe the next year, we tore the old sod house down and built a large stone house, which is still standing with some additions to it and alterations.
Now, let me back up just a minute here, Henry. Your mother, before she passed away, had 2 children, right?
4.
Had 4 children. Okay, now who are these 4?
My sister Della,
Mm-hmm.
and the next sister Josephine,
Mm-hmm.
then myself, and then George.
Right.
George was my younger brother.
And when your mother passed away, how old were you?
Well, I was about 7,
You were about
7, I guess.
7. And the 2
George
older
about
sisters
3.
and George about 3.
3 and a half. There's about 2.5 years difference in us children.
Mm-hmm. All right, now, when your mother passed away, then you were living on the Coldwater at the site of the present headquarters, and who took care of you kids?
Well, my father's sister came out from Tennessee and helped, and then my mother's sister, Josie Westmoreland, the 2 of them took care of us.
So that you kids always had there was a woman there
Yes.
in your home?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
our home.
And well, they were aunts, were they not?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, our aunts. Yes.
Okay. Where did when you were kids, and this goes back, of course, a lot of years, what did you, for instance, you and your brother George, who were a couple of years apart, how did you play? What was your form of recreation? How did you play? What kind of games or what did you do?
Well, I don't remember very much about the games we played. I remember in those days they were always talking about claim jumpers. I remember I just made a little square with a stick in the sand and called that my claim. And I remember one time a toad jumped my claim and I killed a toad.
I can just see this happy toad coming along and jumping his claim. Well, this is real interesting. And when did you start and were given work to do by your father?
Oh, and I was about 11, I guess, or 12.
Did you do? Was this considered a man's work you were doing there?
Well, at the start, I never done a man's work, I guess, until I was 13 or 14.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in those days, it was all open country, and the cattle, there were no fences, and in the wintertime they would naturally scatter. And in the spring, every big outfit would start out with a wagon, or maybe two outfits, so they'd combine and have a wagon and have together their cattle, you know. And then branding and shipping in the fall, well, they'd start a kid out as a horse wrangler, about 12 years old. And then I know I started out as a horse wrangler, and then when I was 14, George was 11, and that's my younger brother. He was horse wrangler, and then I was a full-fledged cowpuncher. I had to stand my guard and take the hard knocks just like everybody else.
You told me a story once about how your father had sent you off somewhere to the east along the Paladora.
Mm-hmm.
He had heard that there was one of your steer or cow or something over there. Tell that story. I think this is interesting.
Well, now my father, he was an awful good father, and he brought his children up in Christian manner. But sometimes he wouldn't, when they started out, he wouldn't tell them what the job was going to be because he wouldn't want to discourage us. So one morning at the breakfast table he says, "Henry, I want you to go over to Marion Eldridge today and get a cow we have over there. And George, you go with him down on Coldwater. There's a cow down there, about Old Hardesty, about 18 or 20 miles. You bring that cow home." He told me, he said, "You get up on the flats just east of here, why, you look over there and you'll see Marion Eldridge's place." Well, I knew I wouldn't, because we had taken cattle back and forth down to Old Grand Valley, which that is 25 miles from the ranch. And so I went, and I got up on the flats, and of course headed east, and I didn't see anything. And I come to a fence once in a while. I had pliers, and I'd go through the fence. And over there on Paladora, about 25 miles away, I stopped at a house and asked the lady as she came to the door. I said, "Where is, I'd like to know where Marion Eldridge lives." She said, "You mean at the old ranch?" It had been in the early days, and I'll describe this ranch. Jack Hardesty originated, and at that time it was S. Circles. Old Colonel Hardesty lived at Dodge. And when he sold out, he didn't have anything but just the border that the house sit on. He sold out to John O'Laughlin of Lake in Kansas. Now this is a different O'Laughlin from the one that lived over there east of Spearman. And he ran it. His brand was Pigpen 7. And Marion Eldridge was his foreman. The foreman for old Colonel Hardesty was Bill J. He was a very fine cowman, and but he's mean to his horses. And coming home from a dance one night, or someplace, he was fighting his horse, and the horse ran through the gate and fell on Bill, or through him, no one knew. And when they picked him up, why, he was unconscious, and he never regained consciousness. And after being ill at that place for a while, they took him to Kansas City, where he passed away. And then Marion Eldridge was foreman for John O'Laughlin. And when John O'Laughlin sold out, Marion acquired this place and was running at that time. So I finally got to Marion's house about 2 o'clock. In so doing, I ran onto a couple of boys in swimming. One of them was Jack Simons and Bert Freeman. Now, Marion had married
I need some help here.
One of the Freeman girls, I forget her first name. But Marion had gone to Liberal, and I went on up to the boys, and we got dinner there. And I went out in the afternoon and found my old cow, and she was kind of mean, but I finally got her in the corral. And I told Mrs. Freeman that I'd just have to stay all night. Oh, she said, that's all right. Of course, everybody kept people, you know, in those days. So that afternoon, Jack Simons and Bert Freeman, they had a little cane field there, and the cattle were getting in there. Breechy cattle, we called them. And they run 3 or 4 in the corral. They wanted to run them in the chute, and they put a little block of wood up in their wethers tied in there with wire. And that when they'd start to crawl through the fence, you know, that'd catch on the fence and they'd back out. Well, in doing so, they let my old cow out. I had quite a time, but I finally got her back in the corral, and that night is a hot night in August. They lived in a rock house there, and so it was always hot, and I had to sleep between those 2 boys back in a corner of the room, and it was pretty hot. But next morning I got up and got my old cow and started home, and I got in about sundown. And I was a little uneasy about George. I stopped on Coldwater before I got home and asked Bill Hedrick there. I said, "Did George get home all right?" Yes, he come by here yesterday afternoon with his old cow.
Henry, how old were you at that time?
Oh, let's see, I was 14. 13 or 14. Yeah.
And you kind of felt it like you'd been put upon just a little.
No, oh no, no, I didn't.
Henry, at that age, when you were about 14, this was how large was the spread that your father had? How many acres might have been involved? That he, of course, didn't own anything, right?
No, on the creek. Just the creek front.
How many thousands acres possibly were under his control?
Oh.
Or that he used?
He used probably 40,000, 50,000 acres.
Mm-hmm. And
that was in Oklahoma and Texas.
Both Oklahoma and Texas.
He acquired a ranch in Kansas after that.
Yes. And the tradition was that if he was on one water, like on the Coldwater, how did he determine? How did your father determine how much pasture he could use or make use of?
Well, halfway to the next water. So on Coldwater, why it's halfway to the Beaver.
Okay, that'd be to the north, and then to the south.
It was halfway to the Paladora, and really, when there was water out there was a lot of rain 1 or 2 years, and that was, well, what we call the Texas Lake was the first when we ran cattle over there, and then as he got more cattle, why, Farwell Lake, which is 8 or 10 miles farther on south, it's filled up, and our cattle ran over there at Farwell Lake.
How many head of cattle possibly at that time did your father run?
Probably 5,000 or something like 5,000 or 6,000.
This was a cow-calf operation,
yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Now this...
my Uncle Charlie, he ran probably 1,500 to about 2,000 cattle too, and they run, in the summertime they'd run their cattle together out south.
Yes.
And each of them would put a cowboy out there, a man, and they'd camp out there. They'd have a tent, and they'd do what they call ride a line. Now, on that Farwell Lake, why, those Paladora fellows would come up there with their cattle would run on the south side, and our cattle would run on the north side, and the cattle water, our cattle kind of push, our men put our cattle north, and the Paladora fellows push theirs south, you know. There's lots of grass.
Now, this Farwell Lake is somewhere in the neighborhood of Groover, is it not?
Well, it's northeast of Groover.
Northeast of
yeah,
Groover.
Southeast of Bernstein.
And what you call the Texas Lake was...
It's out there right south of Hitchland.
Southeast, just south of Hitchland.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just trying to get these things located geographically. When did you start the school, and where'd you go to school, Henry?
Well, in 1889, there was no schools here, and my mother took us children to Liberal, to school. They had just finished the old brick schoolhouse. They called it the old Lincoln Schoolhouse. Old Dad Morris built that schoolhouse, and I remember he built it he took the contract and built it for $17,000, and lost money on it.
How large was the schoolhouse at
It had
Morris?
four rooms. It's a good-sized schoolhouse. It had a primary, an intermediate, and a high school, and then they had one room they had for entertainments.
What did they call it?
Rhetoricals, they call it.
Rhetorical room. Huh?
Yes.
And now, I want to digress here. Dad Morris was a rock mason.
Yes.
And he built several houses around the country. Henry, can you dig back into your memory and try to recall what houses and where they are?
The next year, now old Dad Morris was the best rock mason in the country. He was a good, and his son Jim worked with him. And old Dad Schoenberger, he was another one, lived down there right around Boyd, east of Boyd. And he was kind of a carpenter also. But the next year he went down here and built a house on the Palador for Judge Tyler. Now that house is still standing in a run-down, no one living in. It's a kind of a fallen down condition. And then the next year he built a house right east of Guyman here for old man Pearson.
Now that was probably about 1890. I'm going from some notes that we talked about previously.
It might have been 91.
Somewhere around
might have been
91.
91. I don't remember the year. I remember an amusing thing. Now, Mr. Pearson, it seemed like, didn't get along with his neighbors very well. And he had this good-sized house and well-built, and it built in a kind of the roof had 4 gables, and each of those gables he had a little porthole up there.
A round porthole?
Round porthole. He could look out, and see if his neighbors were coming, or he could shoot out there if he wished. And I bought, and then the next year then, after he built the Pearson house, he come over and built our house.
And that was about 1892, probably.
Yeah, I think 92 or 3, I don't remember.
And this is the house that is now the home of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Hitch.
Yes.
And the walls are probably how thick, Henry?
Well, 2 feet thick.
At least 2 feet thick, which makes it a...
But he built it in those days. They didn't have any cement, and they just got mud down there in the bottom, that black dirt mixed mud, and those rocks were laid up in mud. And the man that mixed that cement, mixed that mud, and he had him hard, was Willis Williamson. And the man that got the rock out of the hills was Bill George, a cousin of ours who came out from Tennessee. Now, Willis Williamson was an old-timer here. He never married. He was kind of a half-preacher. And he was a brother of Jim Williamson, and Jim is county treasurer in Old Beaver County and also Texas County until he passed away. Everybody loved Jim Williamson. He was one of the finest men that ever lived. One instance, when he was treasurer of Old Beaver County, for some unknown reason, the county sustained a loss of some money. And Jim, while he is no way of blame or anything, anyway, he made it up out of his own pocket, and it almost broke him up. And all the people in Texas and Beaver counties loved Jim Williamson. And he could have most anything he wanted in these counties. Well, I started to tell you about building the house. Bill George got the rock out, and Willis mixed the mortar and hauled it, and Dad Schoenberger and Jim Morris, his son, Dad Morris and Jim, his son, and Dad built the house. And a carpenter named Haskell from Liver came down and did the carpenter work. Now, Haskell was a good carpenter. I well remember when the house was finished, my father was sitting at his desk one night, and he says, "Well, you don't need to tell me that a rock house has not much lumber in it." He said, "The lumber in this house cost $600. And the whole house now is a big, about 48 by 20, 2-story house, and he said cost $1,800.
What was cattle bringing, Henry?
Oh, cows bring $8, $10.
Where'd you market?
Yeah, they had to send them to Kansas City.
Now, let's get back to school. Your 2 sisters and your brother all went to Liberal.
Yes, And we went there, school there until March. And we all got the whooping cough and weren't doing very well. And then they started a little subscription school down on the Coldwater there.
Before you get into the Coldwater, who were some of the ones who were in the school with you in Liberal? Do you remember this?
Well, Ralph Summers is there, and Ed, and George Fritz, and there was a Negro family there named Petrie, Ernest Brown, and
okay, well,
Jim Calvert, Big Jim Calvert, and Little Jim, I think, and I don't remember many of the others.
All right, now do the subscription school on the Coldwater Creek. How did that start?
Well, they just raised a little money.
When you say they
They settlers,
families, yes.
families along there at that time. When I came back down there, I didn't remember the Booths and being in there before that, and the Howensteins and the Hankleys, and that was about all. The Eubanks, yes, the family of Eubanks down there.
About what year was this? When
That
this-
must have been about 90 or 91.
Mm-hmm.
In 91. I remember we came home from school, and my mother was passing away at that time, and we got mother to come out and said, "You want us to come in if you want to see your mother before she dies." And went in there, and they were all.
Still no man's land.
Oh yes, it is no man.
Where was this school located?
Well, it's a mile and a half east of the present rock where I live now, in a claim shack that belonged to Harry Reese. Harry was one of an early day cowpuncher here. And one time he was wagon boss for old Anchor D. Dudley over here, and everybody loved Harry Reese. He was one of the best loved old time cowboys of all of them. I remember Uncle Charlie Dudley wanted him to run his wagon for $35 a month, and Harry told him, "Mr. Dudley, I I won't run your wagon for less than $40, but I'll work as a hand for $30."
Henry, along about this time, 1895, there is a prairie fire, a huge prairie fire, and I think it was you were long about Christmas vacation. What's your recollection there?
Well, I was going to school at Liberal at the time, and George and I came home for vacation at Christmas. And we got in home about sundown. We had borrowed, some kind of a buggy and a team, and happened to be there. And they were hitching up the wagon, the boys that worked at the ranch, and filling some barrels up with water. The fire was up there, just crossing Frisco, up there about the James place. And
Go ahead.
And so we wanted to go and help fight fire, which we did.
Where did this fire start, Henry?
I don't know. It must have started probably 30 miles southwest over there in Texas. I don't know where it started. Anyway, we fought fire all night. And we'd had, at that time, we wasn't using brooms. I guess brooms probably cost too much money. We took an old gunny sack and a stick and wrapped it around and made something to fight it with, and we'd keep that wet.
You'd have wagons that
Had a wagon along there with barrels of water.
barrels of water.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And we'd had horses. We'd fight fire. Then the wagon come along, and we'd. I don't remember whether we had horses that time or not. We might just get wetter stacks and fight, and then.
Now, was this the time, or was this another time when a fire started? Were by Old Buffalo?
Well, this is another time. Now, we fought that fire and they put it out over here in the Beaver Breaks, northeast of Guyman.
What about this prairie fire that started by Old Buffalo?
Well, that was in later years. That was in 90, when the railroad was building through here, maybe 99. Yeah, probably 99. It started a switch engine, set it out at Old Buffalo, and of course this country was all open in those days. Only just once in a while there'd be a ranch. A high wind from the southwest And I was going to school at Liberal at the time. I know they let the school out so they could watch it. And by sundown, it was on the Cimarron River stopped it.
Mm-hmm.
And my father at that time and a brother-in-law, my son-in-law, and my brother-in-law's brother, they had about a 50 or 60 acre ranch up there.
50 or 60 section? Yes.
50 or 60 section. And we had about 1,000 cattle in that. Well, the Cimarron River stopped. It got the Cimarron River before sundown. And it burned all of that ranch off, but beside, about 1/4 section in the southwest corner. And we never could figure out, there's not a one of those head of cattle that was scorched in any way. How they, and the grass was, it hadn't ever been eaten off, and it was waist high, and that's sand hills.
And all these 1,000 cattle were in this, about 160 acres that didn't burn out of the whole...
Yeah, and those cattle, they weren't on that either.
Oh, they weren't on that?
No, they were not on that.
Oh, I see.
But we had to move those cattle, of course.
Yes.
And we moved them. My father come up and brought 2 men from the ranch. And then George and I, we got out of school. And we started with those cattle. We bunched them up. And just after we left the place up there, a dust storm came up. That fire was all burned, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that black wind on that black dirt, we couldn't see. My father was in a buggy. But some way or another, we got over to Earl Steele's. That hadn't burned. That was east of the fire. And we stayed there a day or two, and he cut out the steers out of those cattle. And we put them down. Court Brown had a big pasture on right south of Liberal on the Beaver. He put those steers in his pasture and took the heifers onto the Coldwater Range.
Mm-hmm.
And we left those steers there and come back the next spring after grass got good, and got the steers and took them onto the Kansas Range again. Grass up there.
Henry, in all your living around here on the Coldwater, did you ever see any signs of battles that might have been had between United States troops and Indians?
Yes, about a mile southwest of our house, there was a big tree, and that was the only tree along there at that time. And they plowed it up, a little 30-acre field there up, and also there was a corner of that where it all was rounded up, and it was rather sandy. It blew off, and we'd find lots of soldiers' buttons and bullets there, and we knew that there had been a battle there. And then right above that little ways, there was a long row of little, what they call rifle pits. They're all, of course, plowed up. You can't see them now, but they were there until it was plowed up.
But these bullets that were found and buttons were obviously U.S. Army.
Yes, yes. In later years after that, about 1996, there was a band of Indians came through the country up there, and they camped up there by my grandfather's. And us kids, we got the school teacher, the man school teacher, and the minister was staying at our house. All the school teachers would board at our house, and the ministers. The men would stay there. He took us up there, and we were talking to those old Indians. I know I bought some arrows from them, and one thing and another. And one real old Indian asked if there wasn't a big tree down there somewhere, and we told him there was. And he was rather non-committal. He said he fought a battle there one time. Well, we asked him if it was a battle with the Indians or the soldiers. Well, he wouldn't tell us that, but he knew it had to be soldiers because those soldiers' buttons are there.
Let's switch categories now and talk about religion and the early religious life of your home on the Coldwater Creek. All right.
In 1888, February 1888, my mother, who is a very religious woman, wrote a letter to what we call presiding elders in those days. I'll read it. Roy, Oklahoma, February 15th, 1888. Only at that time it wasn't Roy. That was before the Roy post office started. Dear brother, Reverend A.P. George, dear brother in Christ, will you and your good bishop listen to the plea of a mother who lives with her family 140 miles from a railroad. Reared in a Christian community in Missouri, I am trying to rear my children with Christian teachings. Having a little Sunday school on the Coldwater, we would like very much to have a minister. We keenly feel the need of a spiritual shepherd and counselor. Of course, we can give little by way of a salary, but our home will be his home, and we will do our best. The minister closest to us at Fargo Springs, Kansas, occasionally comes to Lafayette, 50 miles from here. Could your mission board help us to have a pastor out here in no man's land? Waiting an early reply and praying God's blessing on your work. Your sister in Christ, Mary Westmoreland Hitch.
Now, what was the result of this letter to the Reverend A.P. George?
Well, in the meeting, a young minister by the name of Reeser got up and said, I'll accept the challenge. He had just been married, and he came out there and preached for a while. I don't know how many years. But the next minister that come, his name was D.J.M. Jones. He had rather a large family, and my father, at his own expense, built him a 4-roomed rock house about half a mile southeast of our present, where I live now, on Coldwater. And he occupied it for 3 or 4 years while he stayed there. And it was later occupied by another minister, too, that had a family. But most of the ministers that came out were young, unmarried men, and they always boarded at our home.
Now, did they do other work other than being ministers?
Some of them taught school as well. I know we had A.M. Livingston was one of them. He taught our school for several years there, and was a minister also. Where
were the church services held?
Well, at first they were held in the old Watt Adams claim shack right east of our house, and then later on the Watt Adams claim shack. It was a rock house. It was larger. It was another half mile down the creek there from us. And school was held there for several years until my Uncle George Westmoreland, who lived up Coldwater about 6 miles above our place. His children got large enough to go, and then we divided the district. And my father bought an old store building at Hugoton, Kansas. If I remember right, he gave $75 for it. And he and my Uncle Jim Barley went up there and they moved it down there and fixed it up. It said located about 2.5 miles southwest of our house, in about 2.5 to 3 miles down the creek from Uncle George Westmoreland. That made about halfway between us, and then we children, we went to it, and then the Eubank they bought an old house, and they moved it on down the creek there about 2 miles below the Watt Adams place, where we had, and then they had school there.
Did not you have, or were not church services first held in your home?
Yes, in the old side house on Coldwater.
Yes.
That's where Brother Reeser preached, the first sermon ever preached on Coldwater, in the old side house.
Now, I might say here that this is the beginning of what is now the Victory Memorial Methodist Church in Diamond, Oklahoma. It is the beginning.
Yes.
And from a religious service in a sod house on the Coldwater Creek in the about what year would this have been? About 1888, 1889, somewhere like that.
1888, yes.
To the present Victory Memorial Methodist Church in Guymon, Oklahoma. And I think this is quite interesting. The beginnings of school and church were almost simultaneous, Raymond, and it's quite interesting. We have taken this up through the time, but before the railroad was brought in here.
Yes.
Now, when did the railroad leave Liberal and come through Guymon?
About the year 1900. R19-1, I just forget.
And this is when the country settled up?
The commenced settling up, yeah.
When the railroad came through?
You know, they didn't think the flats was worth anything in those days, so people didn't ever settle on the flats.
Right. Now, what kind of problems did that create for cattlemen when the country started settling
Well,
up?
of course, it created problems. They had to. I remember when Guyman started. I rode up on the flats this side. Now, our pasture extended to about a mile of Guyman out here. And I was up there, and I looked over here, and I saw a little old 2x4 shack over here. And it was old Jimmy McQuillan's saloon. That was the first building in Guyman.
An auspicious start, I might say.
And Jimmy, of course, never did any good much in saloon business. He drank up all his profits. And he was cook for the old OX outfit over here. He was an Irishman. And when they discontinued, I think they gave him the old headquarters over here.
Uh-huh.
And he is still living in it at that time. And he lived in that, and he had a little bunch of cattle over there as long as he lived in it.
Now, up to the point that Guyman was founded, where did you do your trading?
Well, at Liberal.
At Liberal.
After Liberal was built there, after Rock Island built the Liberal, and I think that was in '87, but I believe.
And before that, it was Dodge?
Yes.
You can't run to the grocery store every day, I guess. You couldn't in those days. How often did you get to go to Liberal?
Me?
Yeah, or your
my father. Of course, he had to make frequent trips to Liberal.
You mean frequent, once a week?
Yeah, no, maybe once a month.
That's frequent, okay. Sometimes you have to define a word. And there's a story that you've told about your father. He was heading to Dodge one time in a wagon.
Liberal.
We're going to Liberal, okay.
Yeah. Well, he was rather sleepy, I guess, and it's kind of amusing. The road to Liberal just angled across the country. There was no gates after they got out of our pasture. There's no fences between here and Liberal. And sometimes he'd go to sleep and driving along. And one time he went to sleep, and the team turned around while he was asleep and headed back home. However, my uncle, George Westmoreland, was coming to Liberal, and he met the team coming back, and he woke my father up and said, "Jim, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Liberal." He had quite a time to convince my father that he wasn't, you know. Finally turned around and went on to Liberal.
Oh, goodness. Then, from then you started trading in Guyman.
Yes, when Guyman started, of course, we started trading in Guyman and shipping from Guyman.
And shipping from Guyman. And now, when you shipped from Liberal, actually it was Old Tyrone.
Yeah, Tyrone.
And this is where Shades Well?
No, Shades Well was down 7 miles this side of Tyrone.
I see. And what was the... did the railroad provide the
railroad drilled that well. Dug it. I think that was a dug well. And they put a windmill there. And Zach Kane was... he either acquired that land at that time or filed on it and improved it up. But he was in charge of the well. But every fall, during shipping season, of course, a windmill wouldn't provide enough water for the herds that came by there. They would water on the Beaver, and then it was 21 miles to Shades Well. Well, it has to have, and then it's 7 more miles on up to Old Tyrone, the shipping pens. Well, the cattle would have to have water. So the Rock Island Railroad put the well in there, and then that was the last watering place. After they'd water there, they'd move on then to Old Tyrone and load the cattle out.
Okay.
But Zach Kane lived there, and he was in charge of it. But every fall, during shipping season, they put a stationary steam engine there in a big tank, upright tank. And during the fall of the year, this man would run that steam engine, and keep that tank full of water. And then they had a row of wooden troughs, about 300 yards long, I guess. They'd fill those troughs with water, and those herds could water there in pretty good shape. I remember a lot of times when I'd go by there. Sometimes in the fall it would have rains, you know, and we'd get wet. And that was an awful good place to go in there behind that old steam engine, you know, and get warm.
And there's another thing that your father hauled to Dodge City. I guess this was a money-making proposition. At that time, there were buffalo in the country. And did your father haul? In other words, he didn't want to go empty-handed up to Dodge. What did he haul?
Well, he said he'd get up on his wagon anywhere on the flats and see maybe a dozen cartridges of buffalo bones. He'd fill his wagon with buffalo bones and haul them to Dodge, and later on Liberal, and he'd sell them for $6 a ton, and that way he'd get some little grocery money.
And he wouldn't have an empty wagon going up.
He wouldn't go up empty.
Yeah, that's real interesting.
I went to school here on Coldwater until I went to school on Coldwater until 1896.
1886.
1896. And then I went to school at Liberal, myself and my two sisters, and boarded that winter at Charlie Summers. Mrs. Charlie Summers kept it. And I didn't go any full terms. I'd always have to get through help shipping. Then I'd get into school in October. We always made 3 shipments every fall, and take about 10 days or 2 weeks to work the pastures and get a herd to ship. And in those days, the Rock Island would furnish a special train for 12 cars. So we'd have to have from 12 and 17 cars, was all one of those small engines could pull. And
so you'd have to accumulate enough cattle.
We'd have to work the range and, yes, gather a herd, and it'd take 10 days, it'd take 3 days to drive them to the railroad. Well, it'd take 4 or 5 days to gather them. And I would never start school until they were through shipping in October then.
Well, did you have any trouble catching up with the rest of the
Well,
students?
I didn't have any trouble, only I never could take algebra. Because they'd have a month or two start, so I never studied any algebra. The others was all right.
So after you got most of your education then in after your start on the Coldwater.
Yeah.
You got through what, high school in Liberal?
Well, I took about 3.5 years of high school, and then I went down to Winfield and took 3 months of business college. And I remember that fall. Well, my father, and like I say, he and his son-in-law and my son-in-law's brother, they fenced that about a 60-section pasture up there. And in the fall of 1902, I took 1901. I guess I went to Winfield for 3 months, and that fall of 1902, I asked my father. I said, "Well, will you pay my expense? Let me go back to college this year?" He studied a little while and said, "Yes, I guess so." Then the next day I was helping him hitch up his team to the buggy, and he said, "Oh, I don't believe a 17-year-old boy needs any more schooling. So now I want you to stay here and run this ranch." So at that time he put me to run that ranch up there, and he had about 3,000 or 4,000 cattle.
Now that was the ranch northwest of Liberal.
Yeah, northwest of Liberal. And I ran that ranch for 6 years, and I proved up a claim there where the ranch headquarters are.
Now you were 17 at the time your father told you to go run this ranch.
Yes.
And go ahead.
So I never had a lot of schooling. I guess that didn't hurt me any. Anyway, I'd rather stay at home and punch cows.
Now, this was, you say there are some 60 to 70 sections under one fence there.
It was at the time, and then they divided it. My father had a lot more cattle, and so they cut it up, and my brother-in-law, Bryce Keating, took the southwest corner of it, about 12 or 15 sections, and his brother took the northeast part, about the same number, and my father got the middle of it, you might say. There's 25 sections there in the middle of it, so that is the pasture at that time, and then we leased a lot of land around there outside.
What'd you do for social activities when you're at this age, from 17
Well,
to 20, in your younger 20s?
Didn't have very many. I remember they did in 1906, I guess. Had a little literary over southeast of the ranch there, about 6 or 7 miles. I remember I went over there one time, and there I met my future wife, Miss Christine Walker.
And what was she doing at the time? Why was she there at this literary?
Well, her mother lived there. Her mother had filed on a claim there, and was living on it at the time. And of course, Christine was living there with her, and she was teaching school down there at a neighbor's. Well, it was really a reconditioned chicken house.
How well reconditioned was it?
I don't remember.
Well, we'll have to ask her. Let's bring in the former Christine Walker and find out about this reconditioned chicken house. Now we've been talking to Henry Hitch all this time, and I think it's about time that we talk to Mrs. Henry C. Hitch, who was Christine Walker, long about the time we were speaking, who was a teacher in as Henry says, a reconditioned chicken house. Tell us about this chicken house, or your school, I mean.
Well, it was it was a large district, and they had a nice school at the other end of the district, but it was an L shape, and so they had to fix one quickly, because a great many people had moved in, and so the chicken house was the only available thing. But it was very, very nicely reconditioned, about 14 by 28, and held the number of children I had, which was from 16 to 18.
You were the only teacher?
Yeah, oh yes.
How much money did you get for teaching?
$45.
A year or a month?
A month.
And did you lived at home? Did you?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Now let me try to pinpoint where this school was. Where geographically, where was this school?
I would say it was about 14 miles north and west of Liberal.
Mm-hmm. Is that do you know the name of the school district?
Pleasant Valley.
I see. Okay, this is what I was trying to find out. And how long did you teach there?
I taught 2 years.
Any special reason why you quit?
Because I could get more money down farther east. I had under an old teacher asked me to come down to a place called Isabel, that's a little north and west of Medicine Lodge.
Oh, I see. Now, you met Henry at a literary. Can you describe a literary for me?
Well, the school produces part of the program, and the community finishes the other part. If there were debates, why, naturally, it was older people, and because the school only went to the 8th grade, and there were not many that could debate, but we'd have a debate, and we would have each child would either speak a piece or sing or something, and sometimes they were quite interesting, and other times they were a little lacking on talent.
This was the cultural life of the community.
In a way it was, yes.
As well as social life, too?
Yes. Yes, it was the meeting place.
Well, now, when you and Henry met, at what age were you?
Well, I was 18, I guess, that year.
And you'd been teaching a couple of years then?
No, I had only taught 1 year. This was the second year.
I see.
taught the first year when I was 17, and this was the year I was 18.
Well, now, did you go east to teach then?
Yes, I taught those 2 years there, and then I went to Emporia. We had such short terms of school that you could get in a spring term, and I went to normal school at Emporia.
And then came back?
No, I didn't come back. I went on down to where I was going to teach because we saved our money then. We didn't make any trips that weren't necessary.
What I'm trying to find out is when you and Henry finally did get together and Henry popped the question.
Oh, well, all of that 1 year. And so we were then engaged for the 2 years. The last year I taught there at this school, Pleasant Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And then the year that I taught back at Isabel, and then we were married in June of that year after I finished at Isabel.
Where were you married?
We were married at Liberal. He had a sister, Mrs. Keating, there, and we were married in her home.
Mm-hmm. And then where did you go to live to establish your first home?
At the ranch where we are now.
You came...
directly there after our honeymoon trip in Colorado.
How did you... tell me about your trip when you went to Colorado on your honeymoon. How'd you get to Colorado?
Well, we took the, I guess, to the Golden State from Liberal and stopped over at Dalhart and then went on next to Trinidad because my mother was living at Trinidad at that time. She had left the claim. And so we spent a few days at Trinidad and, of course, climbed Fisher's Peak and Simpson's Rest. And then from there we went on to had an uncle in Pueblo. And we spent some time there, and then to Denver. We were at Denver on the 4th of July. I remember them calling me about the fights. He'll have to
What about these fights, Henry?
Oh, Jim Jeffries and Jack Johnson. That's when they had their fight. And
Jim Jeffries and Jack Johnson. I mean, now was the fight there in Denver?
No.
Oh.
No, we just heard it over there.
Reno.
Yeah.
Was that in Reno?
Reno.
1914.
And we were sick when old Jack Johnson won it.
Now that was in 1914.
Oh, 10.
1910. Oh, okay.
We were married in 1910.
Yeah, married in 1910.
Then you came back to the Coldwater, or you came to the Coldwater.
Well, we did on our trip. We went over the divide to a place called Marble. My husband had made his first investment in a marble quarry.
Shall we ask him how his investment came out?
Yes, you might do that.
Henry, how did your investment in the marble quarry come out?
I lost it.
Okay.
Ed Guyman at Liberal, he was a leading merchant in this country, and he had invested in this quarry. And he told my brother-in-law, Bryce Keating, about it, and had him all worked up. And I wanted to get rich in those days. So I borrowed $3,000 at the bank and invested in 3,300 shares. Ed Guyman, they was going to pay him 10% for selling it, but said, I don't want anything for selling the stock. So you can buy your stock at 90 cents a share, and that way I got 3,300 shares instead of...
That was a better deal that way, huh?
Well, then, but I lost it all.
So
that was going to make me rich, you know.
You visited the marble quarry on your honeymoon?
Yes.
Crystal River Marble.
Crystal River Marble Company.
Was it in operation?
Yes, they were operating at that time, and also there was another now. It was the Yule River Marble Quarry.
It was the most interesting thing to see, and but all we have to show for it is a nice little marble buffalo that he got an Italian to carve.
It cost me $6.50. So I didn't get it free.
So you had $3,300 plus the $6.50 for the marble buffalo. I think that's pretty good. Now, when you got back to the Coldwater, I don't suppose, Christine, that you and Henry had the place all to yourself, did you? The home where you were living, where you're making your home?
Well, no. At that time, they since it had been the men had been batching there. Why, they had the bunkhouse in what is now our guest room, and so otherwise we had the home to ourselves. Except, of course, his father stopped there as he came back and forth, going to what is called the camp out beyond Hitchland.
Mm-hmm.
And
So you did cooking for the cowboys?
well, yes, but fortunately, I had, instead of a maid, we called it help. I had good help then for the first year, and we were right into the haying. I remember his father asked him if he couldn't marry some other time besides right in harvest and haying. And his father was so busy that he couldn't come to the wedding.
Now, Henry, let's get back to you. What time of in history was the country plowed up and wheat started being a major factor?
Well, of course, the country didn't settle up until the railroad built through here.
Right.
And that was about 1900 or 1901, and then it settled up, took it 2 or 3 years probably to get pretty well settled.
And this is when the flats were plowed
up.
And what was the method of plowing?
Well, just a little rod plow, walking rod plow, what's called a rod plow, it plows sod.
And what I'm trying to get you to say is used mules?
Yes, mules and horses.
Did your father raise some mules?
He raised a lot of mules.
And he raised them for the purpose of draft animals?
Yes, and of course he had to get them broke. And when the country settled up, why, these farmers that came in, a lot of them wouldn't have teams, you know, and they wouldn't have much money. So he'd let them have a team of mules for a year. They'd break them and use them for a year, and then they'd bring them back broke. And then they could take out another team. And in that way, he got them broke, and he could sell them.
Yes. Now, the country had settled up. There was supposedly, I'm asking the question, there was a family on about every quarter?
Most every quarter between here and the ranch, yes, on the flats.
What we're referring to is between the city of Guyman and the ranch,
yes,
which is some 12 miles distance. When did people realize that they couldn't make a living on 160 acres?
Oh, they'd just gradually begin to sell out, you know, and get discouraged and sell out, and
just little by little.
Yes.
And over the period of years, then the country settled up. Henry and Christine Hitch got married, made their home on the Coldwater Creek, and in the normal process of time, 3 children were born. 4. 3.
No, 3, yeah.
Okay.
3, yeah.
Your oldest one is Margie.
Marjorie.
And Marjorie now lives in Florida. And Christine, tell about your bringing up the 3 children, Marjorie, Joyce, and Lad.
Well, of course, there was the problem of the school, and so we didn't have any school out there then. And when Marjorie was 7, we built a school, and my sister came and taught, and they drove about 2 miles, and she attended this school till the first year of high school.
Now, is this the school that is on the Coldwater? It is up
Yes.
2 or 3 miles from the
about
headquarters.
2.5 miles.
And it's still standing. A little one-room schoolhouse. How did the kids get there?
Well, they rode horseback, little little ponies, and had little gates that they could open off the horse, and they did very well, though Marjorie was always afraid of horses, and she would have much trouble with them, getting them started off in the morning when it was cold. They didn't want to leave.
Now, Marjorie attended this school clear up until she's ready for high school.
Yes, the first year of high school she took the examinations, and she went to school out there, but would come in and take the examination.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joyce and Lad, how long did they attend this little country school?
Well, Lad until the 5th grade.
Mm-hmm. And Joyce...
well, I've forgotten just how, but then she would have fitted in there, yes.
Mm-hmm. Then, in getting, how did then your three children get to Guyman to school from the ranch?
They began to have buses then.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a bus that brought all the children from along the Coldwater.
All up and down the creek, they all
Yes.
piled into the bus and went into town. One of the things that we missed on the way, there are a couple of things that Henry had in mind about how this land in Kansas, this quite some sizable chunk, how that was priced. Is this the right way?
We accumulated this land in Kansas in the early 80s. A lot of it was settled up by farmers, and they couldn't make a living, and they sold out. A lot of them did. Some of them they just left their claims with nothing, but a lot of them got borrowed as much money as they could on them and then left. Well, this broke a lot of mortgage companies, and a lot of people just left their land, and the taxes accumulated on it, and it was later sold for taxes. And after my father fenced this land, he became into buying tax titles, and this land from the mortgage companies, our owners, as they could be located. And in that way, he accumulated most of the land, but there was, in that pasture, there was probably 15 or 20 quarters of government land. Well, after 1900, about 1904 and 5, this government land, they come into there and commenced filing on it, and it kind of spoiled our pasture. We had to fence them out at that time, but since then, they bought some of that land, and the ranch, present ranch, is about 20 sections or more, 20, 25 sections, but they have to own all of it now.
Yes. Henry, what kind of wages were you paid when you were growing up?
Well, when I was a boy, my father commenced paying me, I would tramp hay on wagons. They would haul hay and stacked it on wagons at that time. Well, I'd tramp hay on the wagons for a nickel a day.
Big money.
And then I would ride horses all day for 10 cents when I was 10, 12, 11 years old. I remember my Uncle Charlie came down one time and asked me, said, I'd like to have you go up and work for me for 3 days. At that time, they called me Boss. That was my nickname. And my father says, well, if he can do a man's work, he can go. All right, well, Father says he can do a man's work. So I went up there and worked for him for 3 days, handling cattle. And the last day, we took some cattle across down to Tom Murphy. It's about 15 miles across the flats there, 10 or 12 miles. And it rained on us all day. We had lunch, but it got wet, so we ate it anyway. We started home, it was dark, and no roads across there, and we got lost and rode around a little while, and finally looked over and saw a light, and we wound up at our house on the Coldwater instead of Uncle Charles. We stayed all night there, and went up the next day, and worked that day, and at the end of 3 days, he gave me 30 cents, and I rode home happy. In 98, my father bought about 1,200 cattle at a little station right west of Dodge, and we went after them. George went along as horse wrangler. He was 11, I was 14. But I remember when we were working the cattle there and gathering them, why there was a man that's helping work them asked what they paid me. Well, I said, I don't get anything but board and clothes. At that time, my father wasn't paying me anything. But that fall, I remember, he branded George and I together, 30 head of heifer calves, $15 a piece. That had been $450. And but then I kept on working, and I remember the first wages really after when I went to run the Kansas ranch up there, he was paying me $16 a month. In those days, when we built the rock house, Willis Williamson, he worked for $15 a month. and Bill George worked for $15 a month. Those are the regular wages. But later on, like I said, he was paying me $16 a month when he put me to run his ranch in Kansas. And I ran it for about a year or two, and I guess he was pretty well pleased with my work, so he raised me to $25. And I thought I was rich. And I worked for $25 a month until I come back down there on the Coldwater, and was running that ranch for him. And I think it was long in a year or two later than that he started paying me $50.
And this is after you'd been married?
Oh, yes, several years.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the most I ever got.
Well, that's
working.
Pretty big wages, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, that was tops.
What did things cost? Do you remember what?
Well, I'd buy a pair of socks now. They were just old cotton socks for a nickel. And I'd buy a pair of overalls for 90 cents and a shirt for 50 cents. I remember one year when I was on the ranch in Kansas, my clothes for the whole year, I didn't spend anything over $50, $40 I think for a year for my everything I spent. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, I could save a little money.
Uh-huh.
I had to furnish my own bed, and which is pretty good. My father would sleep with me when I went to Kansas up there, and I didn't have any blankets. I know he wanted me to buy a pair of blankets, and I bought the blankets and put them on the bed, and I was amazed, and 2 or 3 years later, those blankets wore out. I remember also when my wife and I came back from our wedding tour, why, she stopped in and talked to my stepmother, Mrs. Jim Hitch, and of course, Mrs. Hitch wanted me, before we went out there, we wanted to see that we had something to sleep in, and of course, I'd just been sleeping. And I was amazed, she had said she didn't know whether there were any sheets out there or not. Well, I didn't know what a sheet was. We just slept between quilts, and I think it's...
Isn't that interesting? Did you, who was the chief bookkeeper in all your operations?
Well, we didn't have any. I kept a little old book of what I had spent, and in it I think socks 5 cents, and I remember one time I told my father if he didn't think he ought to keep a bookkeeper, and he says, no, a bookkeeper would cost me $50, $60 a month, and I don't think I lose that much in keeping my own books. And he'd just let the men at that time go to the store and get anything they wanted and charge it to Jim Hitch, And when he settled up with the merchant, why, they would generally have all the bills, that this boy charged. They'd have his name on them, and that way he could collect for him.
How often did your father settle up with the merchants?
Once a year.
Once a year.
Fall. And these boys that worked for us, now we have to pay them once a week or once
a day,
or once a month. And that day, sometimes they'd work for a year or two before you ever settled up with them.
Before you ever draw up.
If they'd draw us, if they wanted $10, why, just pay them $10. And they'd either keep track of it, or my father would, or I would. I was the same way. And when he settled up with them, there it was. I know some Tennessee boys come out there and worked for me for about 6 or 8 months, and finally one says, when's payday? Well, I says, whenever you want it. I always give you all the money you want, yes, he said. It'd go for sometimes 2 years without settling up.
Boy, things have changed, haven't they?
Things have changed now.
Now we will hear from H. C. Hitch Jr., who we will call Lad on this program because that is the name under which he grew up in this community. He's the only son of Henry and Christine Hitch, and he has grown up with the ranch. He has just returned from Leland Stanford University at Palo Alto, California, where his son Paul was awarded his master's degree after securing his bachelor degree at Oklahoma State University, where Ladd is a member of the Board of Regents and immediate outgoing chairman of the Board of Regents. Ladd, will you tell something of ranch life as you've experienced it?
Raymond, I'm certainly glad to tell you about it. As pointed out, I did grow up on the ranch, attended high school at Guyman, graduated at Guyman, and attended one semester at Oklahoma A&M then. And it was a large college for a country boy, and I became a little homesick, and I transferred to Panhandle A&M College for the rest of that freshman year and then my sophomore year.
Who was president of Oklahoma A&M at that time?
Ed Morrison was the president, and he was certainly fine, and he pioneered the drilling of irrigation wells in this area, starting there at Panhandle A&M College about that time. And I started college in 1935 and finished in 1939.
That's Dust Bowl days, wasn't it?
It certainly was Dust Bowl days, but we had a good time, and although the resources for entertainment were somewhat limited, we didn't realize it, I guess, because we certainly enjoyed life both at Panhandle A&M and over at Oklahoma State University.
Will you relate something of the development of ranch operations since you graduated from college and took an intimate part in that operation?
As I pointed out, I graduated in 1939, and the ranch and the farms were strictly dryland operation. We had 2 good wheat years shortly after my graduation, in 1942 and 1944. Those years, as Father might have pointed out, wiped out debts contracted some years earlier. As when I graduated and went to work for my father, the salary was $50 a month in board and room. I was married to Lala a year later, and I'm sure that I received a raise, but I don't know what it was. I imagine it must have been about $75 a month. But he gave me interest in different cattle purchases, handled a little separate from the ranch, and through the years they were profitable, although we had good years and bad in those cattle business. I had hoped, after seeing the irrigation developing down at Panhandle A&M, that we could drill irrigation wells, but we had to wait until I returned from a year of service during World War II in the Navy, and the availability of natural gas for irrigation fuel. I believe the first well was drilled around 1947, and of course in those days we had trouble getting good drillers, and we had trouble getting the first well drilled. It caved in and the casing stuck, and had to drill a new hole, and the well eventually did go bad after that, and we had to drill still a 3rd hole at that location. But that was the first of our wells, which has now expanded to some 45 or 6 wells on the area.
Lad, what is the diameter of the average irrigation well in the Oklahoma Panhandle, formerly no man's land?
Well, they drill a hole in the ground about 30 inches in diameter.
2.5 feet.
Yes. And put a 16-inch casing, and then put in gravel around the outside to hold the sand back. Call it a gravel pack well. They're, most of them some 350 to 450 feet deep.
What is the production of a fair irrigation well?
I would say 800 to 900 gallons per minute. We have many in the area larger and some number smaller.
And that will irrigate how many acres?
You usually plan about 1 irrigated acre per 8 gallons per minute production for the summer growing crop. And then, of course, you can irrigate your wheat in the winter, and usually people like to think they can irrigate about 200 acres under one well.
You, I believe, are the president of the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association, is that correct?
That's right, Raymond.
In addition to being a regent of the Oklahoma State University.
Yes.
How many cattle, how many acres of dry land pasture are required in the Panhandle for 1 head of cow?
They usually figure about 15 acres per cow unit, which would include the calf on a year-round basis. Since we developed the feedlot, which came in 1952 and 3 and has since expanded, we have sold out our breeding herd and have gone to strictly a stocker and feeder operation, and we figure on about 7 or 8 acres per head for summering yearly.
On this feedlot, it's located on your ranch proper southeast of Guyman, is that correct?
That's correct, about 7 miles.
And what is its capacity?
The capacity today would be 18 to 20,000 cattle.
18 to 20,000 head.
Yes.
Now, I believe that's lighted, and for what purpose?
We think that the cattle, of course, they eat around the clock at odd intervals. We know that they gain in feed efficiency. We think they eat a little more feed, and it keeps them quiet, and we achieve quite a great saving in their cost per pound of gain.
May I interrupt here, Raymond? Is this not true, lad, that you were, your feedlot was the pioneer feedlot in night lighting?
It was certainly the pioneer among the larger feedlots in the area in night lighting, and we did get a little publicity on the Huntley-Brinkley report because of our feedlot lighting efforts.
Well, your family has had some other publicity. I might refer to your daughter, who was Miss Oklahoma. Is that correct?
Jane was Miss Oklahoma in 1964, just out of freshman, just out of her senior year in high school and a freshman in college, and
She attended Oklahoma State University.
she is now attending Oklahoma State. She enjoyed it very much and did her best to represent Oklahoma properly.
Well, lad, I know something of your background. I know that you were born of a religious family, a family devoted to religion, and you yourself have been active, I think, and your wife, in the affairs of the Methodist Church. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the first service of this church was held in the Hitch home on Coldwater Creek.
Down there where Hitch home still is located.
And also you have had activity in partisan politics as a Republican, is that correct?
Yes, we work at that. We feel that every person should take an active part in all areas of politics. We have all been lifelong Republicans and lifelong members of our Methodist Church.
Can you look into the future of this area now that we're developing into a livestock center, having the Swift packing plant and huge feedlots and a well-appointed auction, air-conditioned, and so on and so forth? Can you look into the future of the cattle business in this area?
Well, I'm certainly most optimistic about the future of the cattle business. It is part and parcel of the efforts to secure more income from the land, and we're drilling more irrigation wells in the area all the time. With it, we will have more feedlots and more packing plants to further utilize our natural resources.
Indian corn is converted into ensilage, is it not, as a basic feed for the cattle in the feedlots?
Yes, our cost of gain is startlingly low out in this area because of our corn ensilage and our milo grain combined with the other nutrients to fix the correct ration and bring
milo grain has become recognized as a feed in recent years almost equal to the value of corn, has it not?
It certainly has. We've overcome the mechanical difficulties of breaking the milo grain down so that it could be properly assimilated by the animal, and it is equal to corn at the present time.
Well, go ahead and tell us something about ranch life and the development and what you foresee for the future, please.
Well, of course, some 30 to 40% of all the cattle on feed in the state of Oklahoma are on feed in Texas County. We have some 550 irrigation wells in the county at the present time, and they are drilling them more every day. Water is somewhat hard to find, but they're finding it in areas where they had recently thought that they could not. Natural gas is becoming more widely available through the development of pipeline systems to service the irrigation farmer. The REA power is covering a wider area all the time with more and better power. So I forecast that this will be the most wealthy county in the state of Oklahoma agriculturally.
It has been quite a transition from the days when your grandfather and grandmother came in here and lived in a soddy to the present operational ranch, has it not?
Well, it certainly has. And I appreciate living in the present with giving all due respect to the past. I came this morning from Gallup, New Mexico in 2 hours, and feel that with that speed I can cover the country, and the more I see of the other areas, the more proud I am of the area in which I live at the present time.
Well, we certainly thank the Hitch family for this interview, and this living legend will be in the Oklahoma Living Legend Library at the Oklahoma Christian College at Oklahoma City at Memorial Road and Eastern. And anytime any members of your family, any friends or anyone want to come down and hear this replayed, they can contact Mr. Guy Ross, who is the technical director at the college, and they will be very happy to receive you. And I can assure you, you'll find the college a most interesting place.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Fields. We thank you for the efforts that you have done in recording all this history of Oklahoma for future generations.
Living Legend was inaugurated by Mayor George Shirk of Oklahoma City and R.G. Miller, the columnist on the Oklahoma City Times, the smoking room columnist, and it was of such wide and intense interest that instead of having it as an Oklahoma City institution, it was broadened to a state institution, and I was requested to be the chairman, and that explains my presence here. Well, thank you very much. John, I believe we should go back to Mr. Henry Hitch Sr., or Henry, and record some experiences of riding the cattle trails. Will you conduct that, please?
Well, I haven't heard many of these stories, and I'm sure that Henry can just start in and reminisce a little bit about how you handle the cattle on the trail. Henry?
Well, when I was a boy, a herd would come down Coldwater and going northeast to market or for sale, and they'd always camp just above us in water there on the creek.
And where were these herds?
They'd originate in New Mexico and southern Texas, and I remember my father, when they'd come, the wagon would pass by there, he would always go down to the wagon, and they'd generally give him a piece of beef. And while I was on the ranch in Kansas, the two circles, had a big ranch at Point Rocks. They would always come through our pasture and water and stay all night, and they'd always kill a beef and give us a quarter of beef. But what I started to say, on the trail, or on the roundup, each cowboy had his own individual mount of horses. A mount of horses consisted of anywhere from 6 to 10, generally, but average about 7 head. Well, a cowboy would have one he called his circle horse. That is the horse he'd circle on. That generally took a pretty stout horse, and then he'd have what he'd call his cutting horse. That's what he'd use for cutting cattle, and then a night horse. Well, on the trail, it would generally consist of a horse wrangler and a cook who drove the wagon, 6 cowboys, and the wagon boss. Well, a herd of cattle, when you put them on the bed ground, they'll bed down and they'll lay there about 12 o'clock. And then they'll get up and eat. That's when they put the lights in these feedlots, made me think about this. They'll get up and graze for an hour, and then they'll lay back down. And
this is midnight.
Yeah. And they'll lay there until daylight. And then they'll get up, and of course they'll want to graze again. And they generally have about 3 guards, first and second and last guard. First guard will generally stay there about 11 o'clock, and then second guard till 2 o'clock, and then last guard will stay on there till daylight, and until the men would get their breakfast and then come out and take charge, and they'd go on in and eat breakfast. Well, they'd saw them on the trail, and to get them started, the horse wrangler maybe and the wagon boss, they'd stop and kind of help get the cook lined up and get the beds loaded. They always have to unload their beds at night, and sleep, and get the wagon started, and then of course they'd go on, and the wagon boss, they'd go on then and locate the wagon either at night or where they were going to stay all night or eat their dinner, and then he'd stay there at the wagon, and the boys would bring the herd in, and then after dinner we'd do the same thing. After they'd get the herd on the road, and the wagon would go on ahead, and the horse wrangler would take the horses. They'd go on, and then of course the wagon boss, he'd go on and lope on ahead and camp the wagon for the night. And they'd always hold the herd. They'd stake the saddle horses on one side of the wagon, and then the herd on the other side, because at the night they'd have the night horses staked out there with their saddles on. And if a night horse, if he'd shake his saddle, sometimes it'd stampede the herd, so they'd want to get them on the opposite side of the wagon. And that was the way. It'd take six cowboys, a wagon boss, a horse wrangler, and a cook. And each of those cowboys had about 6 or 7 horses, so it'd make a pretty good bunch of horses. We always hobbled our horses, most of them, at night to keep them from leaving, trying to go home. Now, some outfits said they had an extra man to guard the horse, but I never was with a wagon that did that. But that was in the old trail days when...
What were the names of these trails, Henry?
Well, this one never had any name that I knew of, Raymond, but they would come down the Coldwater. I remember in those days, we never had anything but salt bacon. We generally put up our own bacon, and these trail wagons, they'd use breakfast bacon. I was a little kid going to school, and we walked that 2.5 miles up there at that time, and we'd go by where those wagons were camped, and after they'd leave, they'd have that paper off that breakfast bacon. They'd leave a lot of it somewhere around there, and I'd go along, and I'd pick up a piece of that paper and smell of it on. I'd put it in my pocket and carry it around for a week or two. I'd pull that paper out and smell of it. We never had any breakfast bacon.
When you
just to excite your appetite.
Yeah. When you and your brother George were little kids, you used to go down and camp with these trail herds, didn't? I mean, to go down and visit these trail herds, didn't you?
No, I didn't. Don't remember. I remember little Charlie Westmore.
I guess that was the one.
Yeah. They camped the wagon Snyder Brothers up with a big cattle outfit up Coldwater there above us, about 30 miles, and they were Southern men, and they had Negro cooks, and they camped up at my Uncle George Westmoreland's one time, and little Charlie, he was a cousin of mine. He was a small boy, and he was rather tongue-tied and didn't talk too plain, and he went down there one night. They was about a 1/4 mile away, and they liked him, and they talked to him, and they asked him to stay all night with them. Their brand was OB, but he didn't want to do that. He come back and he told his folks, I like that OB outfit, but I don't like to sleep with him.
Well, Henry, John, I might remark in passing that Henry accepted a place on the advisory board of the Living Legend Library, and that we're grateful for this and for any suggestions that he makes for recording the history of Oklahoma. And we also invite yourself as public relations man to make suggestions to us in this area. And we have appreciated this interview very much.
Well, Raymond, we're just tickled to death that you came out here, and for some years I've been saying to myself that I am going to get some of this down on tape. And if you hadn't come along, then I wouldn't have...
you would have procrastinated.
I would have put it off a little bit longer. Henry, what do you got something else?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, In 1898, there was a young man that grew up in this country and had been to Klondike, Alaska, in Alaska, and he came home. I'll not mention any name because he has relatives still living here.
Go fast.
He said he wanted to organize 25 young men and take them to Alaska to work his gold mines. Well, he commenced recruiting these men. They had to put up $600 each, and he would pay their way to Alaska, and they would work his mines for 3 years, and they were to get 65% of the gold, and he was to get 35%. Well, lots of these boys, they didn't have the $600. My Uncle Charlie had a man named Jake Burton, an old cowpuncher working for him. He could raise about $300, and my Uncle Charlie put in $300 and sent him. Now, when they did that, why, they would share in their gold they made. Each, if you paid $600, why, you would get half of what he made. Well, Charlie Summers, he sent a man or two, and there's a hardware store there in Liberal sent a couple of men, I think, Bert Boyle and Son. And Lee Howard, he was a rancher, lived over here. My father and Uncle Charlie bought his